Curiosity AIs. Roman Civil Wars. The civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony, the rise of Augustus. With the defeat of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the forces of the Republicans who had assassinated Julius Caesar were crushed, but Rome was still far from peace. After the victory, the Second Triumvirate, composed of Mark Antony, Octavian, the future Augustus, and Lepidus, had secured control over the vast territories of the Roman Republic. However, the alliance that had united them against their common enemies was destined to break apart. The empire was divided between the three triumvirs. Mark Antony received the wealthy eastern provinces, including Egypt, where Cleopatra reigned. Octavian, on the other hand, controlled the west, with Italy as his power base, while Lepidus, the weakest of the triumvirate, was relegated to the province of Africa. Although this division temporarily resolved tensions between the three leaders, the balance would not last. While Octavian consolidated his power in the west, Mark Antony grew increasingly involved with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, an exceptionally intelligent and astute woman, had once been Julius Caesar's lover, and now saw Antony as a new opportunity to strengthen her position. Antony, in turn, was captivated not only by Cleopatra's charisma and beauty but also by the strategic value of Egypt, one of the wealthiest provinces of the ancient world. In the following years, Antony split his time between his military campaigns in the east and his life in Alexandria with Cleopatra. This close relationship with Egypt raised concern and scandal in Rome. Rumors about Antony's luxurious lifestyle at Cleopatra's court and his apparent detachment from Roman affairs were skillfully exploited by Octavian, who began building the narrative that Antony was betraying Roman values by aligning himself with a foreign queen. Tensions between the two triumvirs escalated over time. In an attempt to maintain relations with Rome, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, which at first seemed to calm the tensions. However, the marriage was little more than a political alliance. Antony soon returned to Egypt and to Cleopatra's arms, further straining his relationship with Octavian. The real break came in 34 BCE when Antony performed what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a public ceremony, Antony distributed Roman territories to Cleopatra and their children, even granting royal titles to the children he had with Cleopatra. These acts were perceived as a betrayal of Rome, and they marked the tipping point for Octavian, who used this event as propaganda to paint Antony as a puppet of Cleopatra, more interested in ruling from Egypt than serving Roman interests. Meanwhile, Octavian was steadily consolidating his control over Italy and the western provinces. A master of propaganda, he ensured that the Senate and the Roman people saw Antony not just as a traitor but as a man lost to decadence and foreign influence. Octavian presented himself as the defender of Rome and the protector of its traditions and values. A masterstroke in this propaganda campaign came when Octavian obtained Antony's will. In this document, Antony supposedly expressed his desire to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra, rather than in Rome. While the authenticity of the will remains debated, Octavian used it to reinforce the idea that Antony had betrayed Rome in favor of Egypt. This was seen as an unforgivable insult by the Romans, who believed that all great generals and statesmen should be buried in Rome. In 32 BCE, Octavian convinced the Senate to declare war, not directly on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This was a brilliant move, as it avoided making the war seem like an internal Roman conflict. By framing the war as a campaign against Cleopatra, Octavian presented it as a defense of Rome against a foreign threat, which garnered the support of both the people and the Senate. Both sides began preparing for the inevitable conflict. Mark Antony assembled a large army and a formidable fleet, largely financed by Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra contributed her naval forces and resources to support Antony's cause. Meanwhile, Octavian was also strengthening his army, and he entrusted the command of his fleet to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, one of the most skilled naval strategists of the era. The decisive showdown took place in 31 BCE in the waters of the Ionian Sea, near the promontory of Actium. Mark Antony and Cleopatra established their camp on the western coast of Greece, while Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, blocked their supply lines. Antony and Cleopatra found themselves in an increasingly precarious position, unable to resupply their massive army. On September 2, 31 BCE, the forces of Octavian and Antony faced off in the Battle of Actium, a naval battle that would determine the fate of the Roman world. Although Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was numerically superior, Agrippa's tactical brilliance was evident as he cut off the enemy's supply lines and weakened their forces before the battle began. During the confrontation, the situation became critical for Antony when Cleopatra, seeing that the battle was lost, decided to withdraw her fleet and flee to Egypt. Antony, caught between duty and personal loyalty, made the fateful decision to follow her, abandoning his army in the midst of the battle. This retreat sealed his fate. Without his leadership, Antony's forces were completely defeated. After their defeat at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, knowing that the end was near. Over the following year, they attempted to muster one final resistance, but Octavian's forces advanced relentlessly. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian reached Alexandria. Desperate and betrayed by many of his former allies, Antony decided to end his life. In a tragic scene, Antony fell upon his sword but did not die immediately. He was carried to Cleopatra, with whom he shared a few last words before succumbing to his wounds. Cleopatra, realizing that there was no escape, tried to negotiate with Octavian but soon understood that her fate was sealed. Determined not to be paraded through Rome as a captive in Octavian's triumph, she chose to commit suicide. According to tradition, Cleopatra allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a poisonous snake, though some accounts suggest other methods. With the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian became the sole ruler of Rome. In 29 BCE, he returned in triumph to the city, where he celebrated a series of grand triumphs, including one in honor of his victory over Cleopatra. However, Octavian had no intention of returning power to the Senate or restoring the Republic in its traditional form. In 27 BCE, Octavian was granted the title of Augustus by the Senate, officially marking the beginning of the Roman Empire. While maintaining the appearance of republican institutions, all real power now resided with him. The republican system that had governed Rome for centuries was replaced by a disguised monarchy that would endure until the empire's fall. The civil war between Octavian and Antony was not just a conflict over control of Rome, it was a struggle for the future of Roman civilization. Octavian's victory brought an end to more than a century of civil wars and marked the beginning of a period of stability known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for more than 2 centuries. Antony, once one of Rome's most brilliant generals, is remembered as a man undone by his ambition and his love for Cleopatra. In contrast, Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, whose leadership transformed the city's fate and that of the ancient world. The conflict between Octavian and Mark Antony not only altered the political structure of Rome but also deeply influenced Roman culture and identity. Augustus' reign initiated an era of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and expansion, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please consider subscribing.